Continued from the last file, question answers of Look Back in Anger, page 38. All he had felt at that time was the despair and bitterness and the sickly smell of a dying man. Later, Jimmy suffers from Hugh's mother, an old woman, quote, going through the sordid process of dying, unquote, as he puts it. There is often a wistful note in Jimmy's attacks on people who have escaped the, quote, pain of being alive, unquote. He lives in the dreams of the past, the Edwardian world to which Colonel Redfern seems to live in such a dream world. Jimmy's comment on this world has the ambivalent note. Quote, what a romantic picture. Phony too, of course. It must rain sometimes. Still, even I regret it somehow, phony or not. If you have no world of your own, it is rather pleasant to regret the passing of someone else's, unquote. Jimmy's obsession with the past is reinforced by the relative sympathy and understanding between Jimmy and Colonel Redfern. The two are linked together in Allison's comment when she says, quote, you are hurt because everything is changed. Jimmy is hurt because everything is the same, and neither of you can face it. Something gone wrong somewhere, hasn't it? Unquote. Redfern always lives in the delightful atmosphere when he was a high army officer. He describes the past to Allison in bracket Act 2 Scene 2 bracket closed with a kind of nostalgia. His wife relishes the present while he is bewildered by it. Jimmy describes the colonel as, quote, just one of those sturdy old pants left over from the Edwardian wilderness that can't understand why the sun is not shining anymore, unquote. Jimmy is satirical, but Jimmy has the same nostalgia for the past. He idealizes Madeline and repeats well-worn anecdotes of an idealized past. Question 24. Question 24. There are autobiographical elements in the portrait of Jimmy. Do you agree? Give reasons for your answer. Answer. Some critics believe that Jimmy is a self-portrait of the author. In bracket Osborne, bracket closed. Osborne has sprung from a similar socio-economic background and has seen his father die from a similar disease. Osborne married Pamela Lone against his parents' wishes, just as Allison's mother opposed her marriage with Jimmy. Osborne too had a grievance against the middle class, and his family had struggled against the odds of life. Jimmy expresses Osborne's disillusionment with contemporary British society and empire. He is the author's mouthpiece in denouncing the church, the royalty, the conservative government, the upper class, and traditional morality. The vigor with which he lends to the tirades of Jimmy supports the theory that he has put much of himself into the character of Jimmy. Osborne was an angry young man who was dissatisfied with the page 39 Labour government, which could not make any significant change in the social and political life after the Second World War. Authors like Colin Wilson, Kingsley Amis, John Wynne have a shared distaste for establishment values and a disillusionment with the contemporary political life. Osborne articulates the disentanglement of these angry young men with the quote, establishment, unquote, in the mid-50s. Jimmy Potter is a character who represents Osborne's sense of his time as a period of transition. When he wrote the play, he had little sense of what the future held. But there is an undercurrent of idea that culture cannot stand still. Suffering and human struggle have been depicted brilliantly, and the play articulates the author's belief in the progress of culture. Like Jimmy, Osborne thought that in the present there were no brave causes left. There was general apathy and lack of enthusiasm. Jimmy looks to the past, and like Jimmy, Osborne had faith in the commitment to traditions and in the future of the country. The anguish of Jimmy is the anguish of the author for the loss of certitude. Question 25. Who are the targets of Jimmy's attacks? Why does he attack them? Is Jimmy totally bitter and cynical? Point out other aspects of his nature. Jimmy is an angry young man. He is dissatisfied with life in general. Throughout the play, he is cursing things and people. It is not known why he is angry. His anger comes from his disillusionment, from his disgust with the persons, institutions, and things. His main attacks are directed against the upper middle class. He belongs to the working class, while his wife comes from the upper middle class. He is conscious of class distinctions of which he strongly disapproves. Again, he feels utter boredom. Sundays depress him. Quote, the humdrum routine of Sunday has a depressing effect. Reading papers, drinking tea, ironing. A few more hours and another week gone. Our youth is slipping away. Unquote. He attacks both his wife Allison and his friend Cliff for their apathy and lack of enthusiasm. Quote, I long for a little ordinary human enthusiasm. Just enthusiasm, that's all. Unquote. He has a feeling of restlessness. He suggests to Cliff, quote, I have an idea. Why don't we have a little game? Unquote. Jimmy's main target of attack is his wife Allison. He criticizes her for ironing clothes endlessly. Then he shifts his attack against her for being noisy, clumsy. Quote, the way she jumps on the bed as if she were stamping on someone's face. It's like someone launching a battleship. Unquote. He calls her, quote, monument of non-attachment. Unquote. He describes her as, quote, Lady Pusillanimous, unquote, meaning timidity and cowardliness. Page 40. He criticizes Allison for writing letters to her mother without mentioning his name, as if his name were a dirty word. He is so much bitter with his wife that he utters a terrible curse. Quote, if you could have a child and it would die. Unquote. He means that Allison could be shaken out of her apathy and listlessness only by a terrible suffering. Allison's silence and indifference to him aggravate his anger, and he indulges in angry outbursts. Restless, selfish, and egoistic as his responses are, they are nevertheless rooted in a legitimate anger against a world where people make no demands, but are content to accept what they are offered. He turns his attention to one small event to another, seeking any outlet for the obscure sense of purposelessness which drives him. He switches on to Allison's family. He criticizes her mother's behavior as the Marquess of Queensberry. Quote, "There is no limit to what the middle-aged mummy will do in the crusade against ruffians like me." Unquote. She would not hesitate to cheat, lie, to bully, and to blackmail in order to protect the children against men like himself. Allison's mother would, quote, "bellow like a rhinoceros in labor," unquote. Allison's mother is, quote, "as rough as a knight in a Bombay brothel and as tough as a Matilot's arm," unquote. Jimmy's criticisms of Allison's mother are devastating and sickening. Quote, "She will pass away, my friend, leaving a trail of worms gasping for laxatives behind her, from purgatives to purgatory," unquote. Helena feels sick at these vulgar denunciations. Jimmy's attacks on Allison are no less bitter and cynical. He has sadistic pleasure in castigating her. Quote, "She has the passion of a python," unquote. "She is a," quote, "reptilian snake swallowing him alive when he makes love to her," unquote. He brings in sexual relationships for his psychological fear of woman's betrayal. Jimmy attacks Allison's father and brother. He makes fun of the manner in which Allison's father keeps ruminating upon his post-life in imperialist India. He is casting on well-fed glances back to the Edwardian twilight from his comfortable and disenfranchised wilderness. About Allison's brother Nigel, Jimmy is very sarcastic. Quote, "And nothing is more vague about Nigel than his knowledge," unquote. He describes both Allison and Nigel as, quote, "psychopathic, phlegmatic and pusillanimous," unquote. Jimmy is, however, not always angry and bitter. He has lucid moments. He is apologetic to Allison when she is hurt. He calls her, quote, "darling," unquote. They both refer to the game of bears and squirrels. He becomes sentimental in his recollection of the past. Quote, "There is hardly a moment when I am not watching and wanting you," unquote. Jimmy is fond of his wife, and that is why he scolds her for her ironing, for her apathy. He wants an understanding companionship with her. Page 41. Bears and squirrels' game is an imaginary world to which they retreat for relief from the monotony and boredom of routine life. Jimmy has favorable opinions about Webster, Madeline, and Cliff. Webster has got, quote, "bite, edge, and drive," unquote. Madeline, who was once his mistress, is very much, quote, "alive," unquote. She had, quote, "more animation in her little finger than you two put together," unquote. Quote, "To sit on the top of a bus with her was like setting out with Ulysses," unquote. He acknowledges the friendship of Cliff. There is tenderness in Jimmy. He recollects his father dying. He sat by the side of his father's deathbed. He is touched by Mrs. Tanner's stroke and feels sad when Allison refused to go with him. He has a tender scene with Helena in Act 3 when he expresses his appreciation of the way in which she has been loving him. Then there is the final scene where Jimmy says in pathetic manner about everybody wanting, quote, to escape from the pain of being alive, unquote. Jimmy is not an angry young man. He is a man of changeful moods induced by disillusionment and boredom and frustration. Question 26. How does Osborne criticize the middle class life? Is the criticism valid today? Answer. Jimmy is an angry young man who resents the values of the middle class life of the post-war period and is disillusioned with the social and political life following the Second World War. He represents the mood of the young man of 1950s, which arose as a result of the concern about the decline in Britain's position in the world, economic depression, and absence of any significant certitude in the social and political fabric of life. Thus, the play has immediate and topical interest, and this accounts for its tremendous popularity in the mid-50s. But its appeal is universal because the society continues to lack certitude and stability. Economic unbalance all the world over, the political troubles and continuing threats to peace and security in the world agitate the minds of young men and make them rebellious and cynical like Jimmy Potter. Jimmy is disgusted with the monotony of life. He feels that he has not got fair deal in the society. He is a university graduate, but he keeps a sweet stall. This kind of disentanglement still plagues the young men. Post-war ravages in the society have not been repaired. Problems are multiplying, making young men desperate and despondent. Jimmy directs his attacks against Allison's parents, who belong to the upper middle class. Allison's father is, quote, still casting well-fed glances back to the Edwardian twilight from his comfortable, disenfranchised wilderness, unquote. Continued in the next file.